Now, it's interesting as we read that section of Matthew's Gospel that either side of the one sentence I just want to pick up on today, either side of that, we see, so in sort of Matthew 10 and then end of 11 into 12, we see how Jesus talks about the Christian commitment, life and walk as being one of struggle, of discipline, to stick at it, as it were. Before he sends the disciples out in chapter 10, he says to them, be on your guard against those who would seek to hand you over and betray you. Be on your guard even within your families and amongst your closest friends, because even members of your family will turn against you because of the gospel. Be on your guard because people will hate you because of your association with Jesus. Be on your guard because the religious elite and the well-to-do will judge you and criticize you and try to trip you up. Be on your guard. And we see Jesus says then, and still today, that the cost of true discipleship will be high. Because if we genuinely seek to walk the way of Christ, it means we walk the way of the cross. And it will be a tough and a hard road at times. It will feel more uphill than on the flat. And yet tucked away in the middle of this sort of larger sort of dialogue, as it were, we find this little oasis that Matthew drops in. And sometimes we can skip over it as we look at the bigger picture. And Matthew writes these words of Jesus, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And as this morning, as we look at this sort of couple of sentences, I just want us to just sort of allow them to be spoken to us, for you to hear those words for yourself. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened. Family worries and concerns, financial worries and concerns, personal worries and concerns, future worries and concerns. You get the idea. We all have them. We all carry them. And yet how often we carry them quietly and alone. Maybe sometimes we can be ashamed to tell others, too embarrassed. Sometimes we may not know how to tell others, finding it difficult to find the right words. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened. And what we see here in the midst of this bigger sort of discourse is that Jesus reminds his disciples then and reminds us today, it's okay to say, or it's okay to recognize, to admit that we need help now and again. It's okay to recognize, to admit that we feel weak and drained, that life's burdens are sometimes just too much. It's okay. And yet in today's culture, although we are far more open to the emotional side of ourselves, interestingly, it's still not an easy thing for people to admit that they're struggling or that they feel weak. Culture sort of restrains us, if you like, so we don't find it easy to tell others. We'd much rather put on a brave face, a stiff upper lip, and carry on. How often have you said to someone, it's okay, I'm okay? whilst you know that's just not true. Today we can still too quickly consider weakness or the admission of weakness to be a flaw. Still today, if you want to insult someone, call them weak or call them a weakling. And we see how society still tends towards the valuing of strength, of giving the impression that we're okay, we're in control, that everything is all right. And yet here, Jesus reminds us there will be times in life when we do become weak and weary, burdened and troubled. Times when we will feel completely helpless and lost, weighed down, and just feeling like giving up. And yet, because we believe that we need to be strong, we need to have that outward veneer of and composure, sometimes because we believe other people expect us to be strong, to have it all together. So we find ourselves reluctant to show this weakness. We sort of hold it in, we bottle it up. We hesitate to tell others. We're reluctant to ask for help because we wonder what they might say. And worse still, we can even be reluctant to admit this weakness to God, even though he knows. It's fascinating how so often we can be happy to help others in their weakness, yet less happy about revealing our own weaknesses to others. We're happy to ask people if we can pray for them, but hesitant sometimes if people say, "Can I pray for you?" And yet, this little sort of couple of sentences tucked away here in the middle of Matthew's Gospel, they remind us that it's exactly at times like this, that if or as we open our hearts to be mindful of God's presence, as we acknowledge our sense of weakness and dependency, so it's at times like this that we can know something more of God's grace. Because as we open ourselves and admit our burdens and our struggles, as we come to Jesus, acknowledging our weakness, then we see in these couple of sentences, he promises two things. The first thing he promises is rest. And that's not just sort of sitting down and putting your feet up and watching tennis for half an hour, thinking of all the things you need to do afterwards that you've got to get going. It's not just a simple, quick sit down, as it were. But there's something deep-rooted in this about the sense of a Sabbath rest. We see in Genesis, God creates, and on the seventh day, he rested. He introduces to the Israelites as they come through the wilderness the concept of Sabbath, of actually rest. There's something more than just a quick half hour with a cup of tea wrapped up in this promise. Jesus promises rest, something about being held, about being made whole, something of a blessing wrapped up in this. Life today can be busy, we all know that. There's so much that vies for our attention, and there's so many burdens that we can find placed upon us. And yet, when or as we avail ourselves to this promise of rest, when we acknowledge our limitations and our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, so it's then that we find a sense of healing. It's then that we find something within us quietly lifts. And we realize that we don't have to face this on our own. That's the first thing we see Jesus promises, is rest. And the second thing that Jesus promises can at first glance appear to be a little bit more puzzling, because Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. And at first glance, our response might be, whoa, hold on, I've got enough on my shoulders already, don't give me anything else. And yet we see Jesus goes on to say, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Because what we see wrapped up in this is that Jesus comes and shares our burden with us. As my grandma used to say, a trouble shared is a trouble halved. And how true that can be. And in essence, that's what Jesus says to you and to me. A trouble shared is a trouble halved. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so we can know rest. We can know something of Christ sharing our burden, almost carrying us in our weakness. Sensing something of this from Christ within us, but also experiencing something of that through trusted friends around us as they walk with us. I wonder, are you weary and burdened today? Whatever it might be, I wonder, are you reluctant, embarrassed, uncertain of how to share that with someone else? Jesus says to you, come to me because you are weary and burdened. Take my yoke upon you and know the burden shared and the promise of rest. Amen.